again, our panellist, Shogo Williams-Matsuoka, is Planning Director and President nominee for the Rotary E-Club of Western Australia. Shogo has been a Rotarian since 2014. As someone born with spina bifida, Shogo believes that people with disability should be given the opportunity to perform social roles that provide value to the community. Shogo is chairperson of the Coburn Disability Reference Group and has authored a master's thesis on intellectual disability and democratic citizenship. He received his master's earlier this year, and it's now my very great pleasure to introduce our panellist, Shogo Williams-Matsuoka. Over to you, please, Shogo.
Thank you, Kero. Thank you for everybody who's attended tonight. It's a real honour to be a part of these membership voice webinars, and I look forward to starting a conversation about how to recruit people with disability to Rotary clubs. So we'll just begin with the introduction. Okay, so today we're going to cover a few different topics, and these are quite broad topics, so hopefully at a later stage we can go into more detail. But today we'll just stick with some of the basics. And the first thing we'll look at is the background of people with disability in Australia. Secondly, we'll look at the benefits of recruiting people with disability into Rotary. Next, we'll look at the potential barriers towards involvement for people with disability in Rotary. Then we'll look at what are reasonable adjustments and how they can address barriers. Then we'll look at engaging people with disability in Rotary. And lastly, but not least, we will look at promoting contemporary attitudes towards people with disability in Rotary. Okay, so in terms of understanding disability, the first thing we need to look at is how disability is defined. And there are plenty of ways of defining disability. And for me, this is probably the most pertinent definition I've found because it's a legislative definition. And as you can see by this definition, disability is quite a broad definition of different conditions. And they can be of a physical, intellectual, neurological, auditory, or sensory nature. And they can also be psychosocial as well. So disability is quite diverse. And with that, it also brings a diverse set of abilities as well. So it's important to remember that disabilities are also diverse abilities. And over 4 million people in Australia have some form of disability. So we're talking about 1 in 5 people. And the likelihood of disability increases with age, with 2 out of 5 people over 65 having disability. And for Rotary, this is a really important statistic because the average age of a Rotarian is 70. So not only do existing Rotarians could potentially have a disability, but also we need to attract new members as well who have a disability. So that's a really important statistic to remember. And also 28% of people with disability have experienced some form of discrimination when interacting with an organisation. And furthermore, people with disability are more likely to avoid an organisation if they have a negative diversity reputation. So in terms of reputation, making sure that our clubs are inclusive and accessible for people with disability are paramount. There are various benefits for recruiting people with disability into Rotary, and these are some of the main benefits. There are countless benefits I could list, but these are the most important ones. And the first one is that clubs can gain access to people who have acquired specific skills by way of overcoming barriers that can be applied to other contexts. And people with disability can also bring their knowledge and expertise to address barriers towards inclusivity within Rotary, which is what I'm doing today with my knowledge of disability. And organisations that have a diverse membership profile have a better reputation, as I touched on before. And I think reputation means quite a lot to Rotary. The potential barriers towards involvement in Rotary for people with disability could be lack of understanding or awareness about someone's involvement in Rotary. There could be some unfounded concerns that people with disability are less reliable because of their health. And there have been quite a few studies looking at how reliable people with disability are in the workplace. And those studies have found that they're just as reliable as anyone else in the workforce. So that's a bit of a myth that needs to be addressed. And there's also the lack of reasonable adjustments made to Rotary venues and activities. So that could be things like ramps, or it could be to do with communication tools that blind people or people with hearing impairments could benefit from. And there's also a lack of awareness about different methods of communication, because, as I said before, some people with disability communicate in different ways, whether it's through Braille or sign language, Auslan. There are countless methods that people use to communicate, and it's important that we understand those different methods. You know, if we do have people with disability with complex communication needs. So what are reasonable adjustments? So reasonable adjustments refer to the changes made to inaccessible work environments. And these can come in various forms. So the first one is assistive technology. An example of that is screen reading software, which is what some visually impaired people use to do their work. We can also make reasonable adjustments by changing processes. And that could be by maintaining club documents and forms in a verbal format. Another adjustment could be swapping duties that might be unsuitable for a person and their needs. And another adjustment could be additional rest breaks, which might benefit somebody who has a fatigue, or has symptoms of fatigue as a result of their disability. But there are countless other adjustments that can be made, and it's really important to to establish what could be done to adjust the Rotary experience for people with disability by engaging in that conversation. So here are a few tips in regards to engaging people with disability. The first one is to establish relationships with groups that work with people with disability. And I think this is something that Rotary's probably done already with some groups that represent various disabilities. So I think that's always good to continue if that's already been done. And there are countless groups out there, whether they're to do with advocacy or a specific disability group, like motor neuron disease, for example. Another way that we can engage people with disability more better is by following accessibility and inclusion principles when promoting the club to the public. And the way we could do that, or an example of how we can do that, is by having an accessible club website, because the club website is usually one of the first places that people look to join Rotary. So if that can be made more accessible, that would help to attract members into Rotary who have various disabilities. And I've put some links at the end of the presentation that talk about accessible websites. And then the next thing is to think of accessibility and inclusion principles when providing services to the public. And this refers to any events that you might be holding as a club. And I've also put a link to accessible events and how you can make events more accessible for people with disability as well. So that's something to consider. And it's also important to think outside of the box when it comes to accessibility, and I guess get beyond the notion that it's all about ramps and toilets. Again, I think website accessibility is another area that can get overlooked, but it's probably one of the most important ones because the internet is how we engage with a lot of community organisations these days. And I guess the last thing to remember with engaging with people with disability is to ask people with disability how they want to be engaged. Because people with disability will have different needs, they will use different assistive technologies to manage their lives. So, it's important to work within people's needs and not to make assumptions. Promoting contemporary disabilities towards contemporary attitudes towards people with disability is something that we should also do because disability is a social issue. We're not just talking about the impairment. In recent years, the focus on disability is more about removing the social barriers that are created, that affect people with disability, and to address those rather than thinking about how people are affected medically. And we also should recognise that people with disability have the ability to make decisions for themselves, so self-determination is really important, and that we need to recognise that self-determination is a contemporary belief for people with disability. And the language that we use to discuss disability also is important for setting the expectations and I guess the way that we value people with disability in society, and the language that we use to discuss disability has changed over the years, and there are various words that we no longer use, although there are some words like the word retard, for example, that according to statistics it's used every 5 minutes on the internet to some sort of insult. So I think there needs to be more work to be done to address language. And I think as an organisation, we can do our bit to promote contemporary language when discussing disability. The next thing is to avoid using pity and sympathy when discussing disability. And I think it's easy for a lot of charitable organisations who are fundraising on disability causes to focus on how disability can be debilitating and crippling, and how people can be confined, to a wheelchair or their condition. And I think that approach can have the effect of disempowering people with disability. So, we do need to find some way of talking about people with disability in a way that empowers them and doesn't create notions of pity and sympathy. And I think as an organisation, we can also take a leading role in changing attitudes towards people with disability. Because we're an international organisation, we can use our resources to, help promoting inclusivity and accessibility for people with disability. And we also need to challenge limiting beliefs towards disability as well. And talk about people with disability in regards to what they're capable of and not what their impairments are. So just before we get to the end of this presentation, I've put down a few different things to consider in order to make disability inclusion and accessibility possible for your club. And what I advise is to work with your club to see what needs to be done to make your club more accessible and inclusive. And this can be done by asking questions such as, does your club promote contemporary attitudes towards people with disability? Does your club have the capacity to provide a supportive environment for people with disability? How would you incorporate people with disability into performing club roles? Is your club physically accessible for everyone? And does your club's public relations strategy accommodate people with disability? And these are quite big conversations to have, so I don't expect everything to happen overnight. But it's just something that needs to be considered, and it's important to involve the whole club in this discussion, because collective action is what drives change. So in conclusion, people with disability comprise a large section of the population, and many of them are potential Rotarians. Accessibility inclusion is the first step to actively involving people with disability. And making reasonable adjustments can address some of the barriers that might affect people with disability in Rotary. And we can also think about accessibility and inclusion in a holistic manner when engaging with people with disability, and go beyond the notion of ramps and toilets being the main accessibility features. And we also need to recognise that disability is caused by socially constructed barriers that restrict life choices, and go beyond the medical understanding that we've had for so many years, and just focuses on the impairment and how that restricts people, because there are socially constructed barriers that can be restrictive as well. And then lastly, work with your club members to build an accessible and inclusive club for people with disability. And I've provided some reading material just to, I guess, broaden your understanding, because obviously it's hard to cover so many different topics in 20 minutes. So hopefully this will broaden your understanding. And if you do have any questions, feel free to use the Q&A box, or feel free to contact me as well. I'm happy to, to speak to anybody through Facebook or LinkedIn. I will make sure that people have my details, so that we can have further conversations. So thank you everybody for listening, and I'll proceed to the Q&A session.
Right. Thank you, Shogo. We do have some questions here for you. The first question is, and I think this is perhaps a restatement. How important is language when addressing the issues of inclusion and disability?
So I think language is probably one of the most important things when it comes to inclusivity, because language, I guess, sets the expectations that people have for people with disability. As I said before, by using derogatory terms such as retard or handicap or spastic, we're creating, stigma for people with disability. We're using language that, that has negative connotations, and, portrays people with disability, well, for their impairments as opposed to, to their abilities. So I think when it comes to addressing people with disability using language, I think it's important to recognise people first before the disability. So, I think using the term people with disability is quite important, because we need to recognise that people with disability are individuals, and that their group identity is second to that as being a person with disability. Everybody has different abilities, different needs, and we should consider that first before anything. So yeah, people first for me. But other people have different views. So the language can be, people have different expectations about language. But I guess that's my take on it.
Fine, thank you, Shogo. Okay, a follow-up question to something you said in your presentation. This is about specifics. What specific actions can we as a club take to improve the attitude of society to inclusion? So this is practical steps a club can take to improve that broader attitude to inclusion of people with disability.
Well, I guess the first thing is language. I think that's really important. And I think accessibility as well. I did touch on, making sure the way that you engage people with disability is inclusive. So having an accessible website, like even on Facebook, I think a practical step to take is to caption photos that you might produce on your page, because that helps people with visual impairments to I guess have visual descriptions of your photos and that. So yeah, there are various ways of including people in club activities. And I think the most important principle to follow is not to make assumptions as well. So if you do have a club member with a disability, I think it's important that they're that you maintain constructive dialogue, and that their needs are addressed.
That leads into another question we have here. During your presentation, you made a very good point about the ageing population in some Rotary clubs, and that as people get older, so they can be afflicted by disability. They can experience disability. So where we have a situation where existing Rotarians may have disabilities, but those disabilities may not be obvious. For example, obviously some forms of disability are more easily identified than others. How could a club, if they were looking to identify things that may inadvertently be excluding current members through having a disability, how could a club address that? Obviously, it's a very sensitive issue.
It is, and I think one thing I didn't touch on in my presentation was invisible disabilities, because there are some disabilities that are more visible than others. Having a physical disability myself, mine's more visible because of the wheelchair. So that is a very good question, because it is quite hard to address invisible disabilities. And I guess what I could say is that it is important to have practices and procedures that address any just indirect discrimination beforehand, so that if there is a situation where somebody does have a disability, then at least there's some sort of policy or procedural framework that can respond to that. So somebody does have a disability and it's not obvious, and at least some of those procedures might be able to address that more proactively. I think maybe it's better to be proactive rather than reactive when it comes to addressing people's needs, and I think having the policies and procedures might help with that.
What are some good partner organisations that Rotary clubs could partner with to help to break down the barriers to inclusion?
So there are various organisations, I believe, that are furthering the inclusion and accessibility for people with disability, and that's organisations like People with Disability WA who advocate on behalf of people with disability. I think they understand quite a lot when it comes to the, some of the attitudes and physical barriers that people with disability are trying to overcome. And there's also Inclusion WA as well. They're quite notable for promoting inclusivity for people with disability. There's also the Youth Disability Advocacy Network, who are affiliated with the Youth Affairs Council of WA. So if you want to engage with young people with disability, then they're a good organisation to partner with as well. And I've met some of those members during Coburn Disability Reference Group meetings as well. So those might be examples of groups that we could partner with if we haven't done so already. And I think those groups are committed to promoting positive attitudes towards people with disability and overcoming some of the socially constructed barriers that that affect people with disability.
Thanks, Shogo. A question here from I think this one is a pretty special question. Have you found your experience in Rotary has been inclusive? Are there things that we could do better?
I think for the most part it's been quite inclusive. I haven't come across too many situations where I've encountered anything that made me feel, unincluded or anything. I was a bit disappointed by the Rotary conference we had last month, where there wasn't ramp access to the marquee. I thought that was a bit disappointing, and I think that could have been avoided if there was a bit more consideration about who was there and some of the needs that people might have. I think when you plan big events like that, it's important to to ask people whether they have accessibility needs, and that could probably be done on the application form, and in that way we can try and make events more accessible. But other than that, I haven't really experienced anything that has made my experience less enjoyable on the basis of accessibility or inclusion. Yeah.
The next question comes to this is another question to do with language, but a different aspect of it. This question is, would you consider the name of our camp, Handicamp, to be acceptable when considering the issue of language as a whole?
So I've thought a lot about the Handicamp issue because it has, been a contentious issue, regarding the language of people with disability, and I think the work the Handicamp does is great. The actual camp isn't the problem, but I do think the use of the word handicap, is a outdated term, and it does have connotations with the medical understanding of disability, and it tends to focus more on the impairment as opposed to what people with disability can do and what they can contribute to society. And I think in order to be in line with contemporary attitudes towards people with disability, I think the name needs to be something different. In my view, I think I think everything that Rotary does needs to be in line with contemporary attitudes towards people with disability, and that would be a good example of addressing of addressing that.
Thanks, Shogo. A broad question here. How can we change our PR to better include people with disability? This gets back, I think, to your reference to PR strategies, to improving our PR strategies and the like. I think this is looking for some specific examples of things to do.
So I guess it's, looking at all aspects of that communication. So the first thing is the websites, which I touched on. Our use of social media can also be addressed. So whether we're using captioning when we're posting photos, so visually impaired people can, can have visual, can have, descriptions of those photos. What's other things we could look at? Are we captioning our visual content as well? I think that's really important. And I think it's become a lot easier to caption videos these days. So it's just about, looking at different techniques that can, support our PR strategy. I'm happy to take that question on notice, though, to see if there's any resources available that might help inform a PR strategy, because I think it's something I should have included in the resources at the end of the presentation.
I think that those who care about this topic, and that's a fairly large part of our Rotary population, would welcome specific pointers on in this area, Shogo, because certainly I think that a lot of whatever exclusion there is, or lack of inclusion.
Sorry, I'm having difficulties trying to hear you.
Yeah, just saying that I don't think there's any lack of goodwill in that department. So, yeah. Do we have any other questions? No. It looks like we've come to the end of the end of our list of questions at this stage, Shogo. So this is probably a good time to close the webinar session. If there are no other questions, let's just allow a moment. If anyone has any, no, nothing coming through. So yeah, thank you for your excellent presentation tonight, Shogo.
Thank you, and feel free to get in touch with me if you have any further questions. If you want to engage in more of a one-on-one dialogue with me, I'm happy to engage myself. So thank you everybody for listening, and I look forward to continuing this discussion at a further time.
Thank you, Shogo. Thank you again, Shogo, and farewell everyone, and thank you for being with us tonight.